When Adam Smith's magnum opus, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, was first published in 1776, it was met with enthusiastic acclaim. Sold out within 6 months, Smith was kind of the J.K. Rowling of his time, if the entire plot to Harry Potter were quarterly fiscal reports from Gringotts Wizard Bank. Intellectuals across Europe and the Americas praised the book's insight and vision. Others, their agendas challenged by this book, lashed out against Smith's ideas. Seems whichever side of the debate you were on about economics at the time, when someone brought up Wealth of Nations, you got excited about it. That can be difficult to understand if you've ever tried to read this book and realized how extremely boring it is. Hi, I'm Melissa, and you're listening to Melissa Splains the Classics. A YouTube search of Wealth of Nations will mostly turn up ASMR videos of somebody whispering the contents of this book into a hot mic to help you fall asleep at night. It's not so much a work of literature anymore so much as it's a rhetorical tranquilizer. Adam Smith may have gone from trailblazing economist to postmodern white noise machine, but boring doesn't always have to mean worthless. Sometimes boring can mean challenging, demanding you be an active consumer of ideas instead of some literary pillow princess, only interested in laying back and getting your feelings filleted by young adult novels. Reading teen lit is cute when you're 13, but at 35 should be considered statutory reading. Smith presents his ideas concisely, but that doesn't mean that they're simple. It's been well over 200 years, and we're still debating the best ways to use concepts like the invisible hand and the division of labor to inform our economic policies. So you want to know how to read Wealth of Nations in a way that doesn't put you to sleep? Well, I don't know. But I can share how I got through Wealth of Nations, and hopefully it helps you feel the same appreciation. Maybe not for the syntax or style, but for what it represents. By the 18th century, authoritarian economic policies had taken away the rights of the average person to make a living in a way that respected their individual autonomy. Rules about what fabric you could wear, what kind of jobs you could work in, where you could live, I mean, you name it. And the punishment for breaking those rules included imprisonment and mutilation. Basically, everyone was living like a woman in Saudi Arabia, which means at the time, Europe had an impressive level of equality between the sexes, if you were poor. Smith's revolutionary ideas had the potential to pull millions of people out of poverty. I can only imagine what it felt like to be so close to that reality that you could almost taste it, and to know that the only thing standing in the way was, as usual, human ignorance, fear, and greed. Quick historical recap for context. For hundreds of years after the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe's main economic model was a little case system that we call feudalism. You know that part of European history that Hollywood portrays as a bunch of dirty people with bad teeth running around forests, fighting hogs for turnips? Feudalism meant that if you were a serf, you lived and worked on a feudal lord's land and had to hand over most of your crops and cattle in exchange for that lord's patronage and protection. Protection from who? Well, the lord, of course. He'd come by your cottage like a 1930s mobster in a Brooklyn candy shop, tap the walls, you look at your hogs, and then he'd be like, hey, what a nice little farm you got here. It'd be terrible if somebody were to burn it to the ground. How about you move all of this over to my place and we'll see about making this farm a little more flame retardant. Then we have the 15th to 18th centuries. First, industrialization. Thousands of former serfs moving to the big city to make it on their own. Finally escape all the gaslighting, violent lords. Like a mass-scale Ike and Tina Turner story. Second, scientific discoveries that challenge the authority of the church. Luckily, we still have some flat earthers around in the 21st century to challenge the authority of reality. Thirdly, European global exploration, conquering weaker foreign countries, colonizing parts of the Americas and Africa. This is our favorite part of history to navel gaze about because now everybody's finally talking about us. The Europeans get super excited about the Americas after some natives gift a solid gold toe jam scraper to some conquistador, which is Spanish for freelance asshole. Most natives think gold is cool, but mainly good for decor, right? Class up a pair of moccasins, pimp out the wigwam, the kind of things you'll find in a 19-year-old girl's Pinterest board. The Europeans are thinking, well, these suckers are taking glass beads for gold, so they must have more hidden away somewhere. So they do a shakedown. They try to force the natives to dig up more gold, but then the natives pull this magic trick called, okay, everybody die of smallpox on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. All this activity leads to the phasing in of a new system called mercantilism, a kind of economic nationalism. The new trend was to believe that national wealth and power grew best when the nation did whatever it took to increase the nation's exports to foreign markets in exchange for money. So European nation states colonized and fought countless wars to secure bigger and bigger foreign markets for their exports so they could hoard all the gold that they could. This is where Adam Smith comes in to rock the foundations of this entire paradigm, and the Scottish Enlightenment is right there with him. A group of intellectuals and artists like David Hume, Francis Hutchinson, and my best dead friend in the whole world, Robert Burns. Believers in human reason and the rejection of any authority that can't be justified by logic. A Marvel universe, if you will, of super nerds, dedicated to truth and justice, using esoteric powers like the scientific method and reason. And because this enlightenment was a Scottish one, they all agreed that the best venue to host this very important intellectual work was the local pub. So after 17 years of intense bar crawls across Scotland, Wealth of Nations was born. Smith goes for the mercantilist jugular in book 1, writing that true wealth isn't found locked away in vaults full of gold and silver, but in what that metal represents, and that is, drumroll, labor. Farm laborers in particular, the guys who still have the stink of surf on them, make all of the food that we eat and all of the raw material that goes into manufacturing. Whatever's left over from what a nation eats and wears gets turned into all kinds of goods, services, and luxuries. Whatever's left over after that is exchanged for more cool stuff in foreign countries, plus gold. So a nation's true wealth should be measured by how much that labor produces, because money is only worth the amount of labor it can buy. If there's nothing to buy, gold is worthless. But where there's no gold, and only people making things, you can just exchange one thing for another. Seems simple, but it was actually one of the most eye-opening observations of European political economy at the time. Smith also shoved a piece of buttered toast into a teapot without noticing one time, then, after pouring himself a cup from the same teapot and drinking it, declared it was the worst cup of tea he had ever had. Very controversial figure. The goal of a nation shouldn't be sleeping on piles of gold like some mythological dragon. It should be to make labor more efficient. And the best part is, the best way to make your labor more efficient is to do less, not more. Society already developed a strategy to make labor more efficient called a division of labor. At one point, he was so lost in thought while touring a leather factory that he walked right into a tanning bath and had to be rescued from it. Luckily, it was a pit of leather bathwater and not a vat of needles at the pin factory that inspired one of the most famous quotes of his about the division of labor. Pins used to be made by one guy who could produce maybe 1,000 pins a year. One guy in charge of making pins had to waste time moving from one task to the other, fire up a forge, he might get distracted, masturbate, nap, etc. Dividing up all these different stages of producing a pin into 18 separate jobs at least allowed for way more pins to be created. Each person in charge of one stage of pin making became so good at that one job that was already simpler and took less time to complete that they could get through tens of thousands more pins than the one masturbating pin maker. And yes, there was a time where dividing labor up into repetitive, utterly meaningless little jobs that go nowhere was actually considered pretty awesome. The most important takeaway here, Smith said, probably as a leather worker hauled him out of that tanning bath, was that nobody really invented the division of labor. According to Smith, it all started with people's natural inclination to negotiate. In hunter-gatherer communities, you grew, hunted, you made everything you needed. If you made dorky-looking shirts, well, that's what you wore. A dorky looking shirt. Then someone realized that people wish they had cool shirts, so they could just specialize in making hundreds more cool shirts to exchange for what they needed. Everyone else is cranking out more of their specialties too. Steak, cheese, hurdy-gurdies, opium pipes, you name it. And the fact that more commodities can be produced with the division of labor means that labor is more valuable because they yield more per person. That means laborers in the 18th century could buy more of life's necessities, and their quality of life increased to a level that was never seen before. This actually made rich people nervous. They said things like, well, if we let these people get used to living like human beings, they'll never be able to live in squalor anymore. Yeah, you stupid bitch, so what? Also, you couldn't be more wrong about that. Never underestimate people's proclivity to live like pigs. Just look at Hershey bar flower bouquets online for reference. So if the natural guiding reason of regular everyday people led to something like the division of labor, maybe we should trust in people a little bit more. Even traits like laziness play a role in the progress of humanity. Here's a quote from Adam Smith. In the first fire engines, a boy was constantly employed to open and shut alternately the communication between the boiler and the cylinder, according as the piston either ascended or descended. One of those boys, who loved to play with his companions, observed that by tying a string from the handle of the valve, which opened this communication to another part of the machine, the valve would open and shut without his assistance, and leave him liberty to divert himself with his playfellows. One of the greatest improvements that has been made upon this machine since it was first invented was in this manner the discovery of the boy who wanted to save his own labor. What an insightful story. And I'm not talking about how it didn't occur to anyone at the time that a toddler working a full-time job as a piece of sentient engine machinery was kind of fucked up. It means that laborers don't need draconian laws. They don't need to be threatened with amputation, hanging, or enslaved to be productive members of society. It's a real bummer for the BDSM community. When we can make our own decisions without interference, we can be agents of universal good by serving our own interests. Smith isn't just saying that it's good to be selfish. selfish, although that's exactly what he's saying. But it's a little more complex and interesting than that. It means that human beings have evolved to anticipate the needs of others in our group and how to provide for those needs in exchange for what we need. So we can't help but help everyone when we help ourselves, which means that the foundation of commerce is actually using our capacity for empathy to help ourselves. That's a level of optimism that's revolutionary for that time. And it might even be too optimistic for the 21st century if you consider current global media trends trying to guilt people into eating bugs. Smith laid out the basics of money later on in book 1 too, stating that money was created as a way to make up for the limitations of bartering. Commodities like cows or corn, they spoil easily. They're too big to drag around or trade for what you actually need. Let's say you want to have sex, for example. If all you have is cows, you can only ever buy an entire cow's worth of lube. So it's only worth the trade if you are hosting a very large orgy, or if you wanted to rub lube on all the water slides in a theme park to make them extra scary. So we needed to come up with a way to exchange our labor for goods in a way that would have a long shelf life and be easier to carry than a metric ton of unscented hypoallergenic lubrication. Unscented hypoallergenic lube. Gold and silver don't rust or spoil. They're small, they're convenient to carry around, they're easy to shape into small coins. They're known as soft metal, although a stripper getting hit in the side of the face with a gold doubloon might disagree. Because labor determines price, the less work it takes to make something, the cheaper it is and the less value it should have, even if it's very useful, like water, for example. Commodities that are useless can nonetheless be valuable because of how much labor it takes to make them, like diamonds. Does that not make sense somehow? Have you perhaps thought of loads of examples where people pay for things like celebrity panties on eBay, stuff like that? Well, that's because Adam Smith was actually wrong here. It's called the water diamond paradox. Classical economists like Smith hit a wall when it came to how value was determined because labor isn't what determines value. It's consumers' perception of value. It's called the labor theory of value. And a side note, that's the theory that Karl Marx used as the basis of his communist theory. So the foundation of Marxism is actually one of the biggest fallacies of Wealth of Nations. Labor value theory was later replaced by the more accurate marginal value theory in the 1870s. That proves that it's actually people's immediate perception of what something's worth when it's in front of their face. We rely on our subjective experience to determine value, which sounds a little psychotic, I guess, but it mostly works. A real-world example of how Smith's dynamic is wrong is going to Starbucks, for example, and deciding, "All right, after giving it some thought, I've decided to exchange this money, a symbol of my hard work on OnlyFans as a foot model, for that overpriced pumpkin spice latte made by a disgruntled Dominican barista." So neither of these services should be worth anything, and they don't require much effort or even an IQ over 70. But guys love feet, and models love blowing money on pumpkin spice lattes. So let the good times roll. There's no way of getting around the fact that this is a very boring book, and that Adam Smith was probably a pretty boring guy at first glance. That is, until he fell into a hole or wandered around town in the middle of the night in his pajamas. But it's also challenging and useful. Useful things in life, like the sun, air, and this book are often so essential that we can forget they even exist sometimes. So maybe stop and remember to breathe air. Feel the sun on your face and read a boring ass book once in a while. I promise you, you won't regret it that much. That's all I have to say about all that. Until next time, thanks for listening to Melissa Splains the Classics.